to do today is dive a little deeper into middle housing and in general just what the concept is. We want to address some of the topics of interest that arose out of the October Planning Commission meeting. We want to, as I mentioned, share results and the testing that our staff has done over the last 2 weeks. We also want to provide an opportunity for more in-depth Q&A for you all, so we encourage you all to ask your questions throughout the presentation. We do have a lot of slides, but please feel free to go to this office at any time. I'll try to answer your questions. So, as I said, we are going to provide this high-level overview of the code. We're also, I did mention, we're going to provide you all a summary of public input. That also came up as a point of interest in the last Planning Commission meeting. Is there anything that's missing from this agenda that you all have wanted to cover as it relates to middle housing? If something comes to you during the course of the meeting. Everyone hear me okay?
Speaking into, yeah.
Is that better? I can try something else. Maybe you don't have any at all. Okay. So what is missing? What is middle housing? Middle housing is, there it goes, half-scale buildings with multiple units in a walkable neighborhood. This diagram represents the full range of housing types between the scale of single-family homes to we call them multi-unit buildings. That really, this full range of housing is what needs to be built to meet our housing needs. What we see in the middle are what we see in the middle are housing types that represent what we call, what we're referring to as the middle. And I think it's important to note here is that most neighborhoods built today and in the last 40 years have either been multifamily or single family. And middle housing types such as duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes really do provide a more diversity of housing options that can support local serving, retail, and more transportation options. So what will make a successful middle housing proposal or policy? So is it compatible with existing houses on the block? Is it comprised of smaller multiple units? Is it located in a neighborhood that can actually support, the infrastructure can support these walkable areas? So any proposal should include a dimensional design standards that ensures that it's compatible with the existing neighborhood. It provides that additional opportunity for housing, and it really is focused on that specific area where the infrastructure is there. So where does middle housing work? I've kind of already touched on this, but you really need something to walk to besides more houses. Missing middle housing types are best located in that walkable context. And walkable context means not just pedestrian facilities, such as sidewalks and crosswalks, but also places to walk to. So a walkable area is defined as a 10-minute walking distance of centers that provide services, shopping, and hopefully transit opportunities. Middle housing types are most successful when located in the existing or newly built walkable context. The TDR, the traditional neighborhood residential land use classification, which we focused on for this particular proposal, is already designed in our already designated in our long range plans and has a definition that aligns with areas supportive of middle housing. So I'm going to read that to you. So it's characterized by neighborhoods where a mix of detached and attached houses, sidewalks, and smaller lots and alleys exist. Neighborhoods where lots are typically less than 50 feet wide and usually have sidewalks, alleys, and this area is essentially the 19th, 20th century grid neighborhoods of Knoxville. And that's what's shown up here on the map. I know it's not a very good map, you can't really see the details, but the areas highlighted in the yellow, the darker yellow, are the TDR areas. I'm going to turn over to Lindsay, and she's going to go over how it's gone missing and how we can allow it again.
So we will be kind of switching back and forth several times through this. So this really is, we want to have an opportunity for you guys to stop and ask questions at any point. So please do stop us. So what we've shown some of these slides before, but what we wanted to express is that there's really a large amount of precedent for these forms of housing and these development patterns. So on the left side, you can see an example of plan books, like the Sears catalog that sold duplexes, quadplexes, et cetera, for widespread distribution throughout the United States. There's actually an example similar to the one on the left on Clinch Avenue in Sanders, I believe some variations on that are seen throughout Knoxville. These forms remain within our existing historic neighborhoods. So the aerial view that you see on the bottom right, that's in 4th and Gill, and that you can see so you can see a small multiplex. That's what we would call it today. And then I believe there's a quadplex and then also some duplexes. And the visual here is that these all do fit within the streetscape that also has single family houses visible there. The top right is a plan book example of a minimal traditional house. So this is a housing form that originated in the mid to late 1930s, and it was especially popular immediately after World War II. These were designed as single family houses, but they were really small units. And I think the thing to consider here is they were designed to be added onto. So here you can see this one has a side addition added in a minimal traditional that has a dormer addition, so it got a second story, and then there's a rear addition, so it could have a larger kitchen at some point. These forms of housing are really prevalent in the TDR land use areas. A lot of the neighborhoods that are in this land use area have the minimal traditional housing forms, and these are naturally supportive to additions and the conversion side of it. So they're small in footprint. These are originally one unit, but they were designed to accommodate additions on the sides, the rear, and in the dormers. So that could hold another small unit, especially in the areas of these neighborhoods that have significant slope changes. I'm thinking of Belmorris, the rear elevations, they have a sort of walkout basement level that could easily support a rear addition for a smaller addition and a second unit.
Well, you've got a question like that.
Mm-hmm.
That's the first time I remember that type being discussed.
Yeah.
I've seen the other two examples. I guess, how does that, or Winston, to use that name, how does that example, where it does start as a single family, fit into the missing middle, since most of what we've talked about seems to be these duplex, triplex? Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And so I think this ties back to something that y'all had a lot of discussion about at the commission meeting, and we've heard a lot about, is the conversion aspect of this. So how do we retain our existing housing stock and the look of the existing streetscape while allowing these houses to accommodate more units if the property owners wanted to? And one of the things is that a lot of the neighborhoods in the TDR aren't our oldest, as in 4th and Gill and Old North, that have these larger houses already have them. But there are these sort of 1930s, 1940s neighborhoods that were specifically designed in their origins to be added onto. And they're relatively small units right now. And then they have space to accommodate an addition, say, to be converted into a duplex. So that kind of goes to that conversion side of it. So in terms of the other side of precedent too, I think the conversion aspect and the demolition conversation is something that y'all touched on. And so this is really has been a major topic in the historic preservation community, how these historic neighborhoods and how older houses can contribute to the nation's housing shortage. And so this is just to indicate that these patterns already exist. We've reviewed a lot of research done by the National Trust for Historic Preservation and then municipalities preservation nonprofits. There was a study commissioned by the Los Angeles Conservancy that highlighted positive correlations between local historic districts and then medium to higher density development. Within the city of Los Angeles's historic preservation overlay zones, 69% of their buildings provided more than one unit of housing. So that's 69% of the historic districts in LA provide more than one unit of housing. They're not just single family houses. And the report also found that in that city, over 12,000 new housing units were created through adaptive reuse, rehabilitation, and conversion of historic buildings during the last 20 years. So old buildings are part of this. Yeah.
So Lindsay, when that happens, like take LA for example, are there existing homeowners that are making these changes to their residents, or are they commercial buyers or developers that are coming in and buying them and changing them and converting them and holding on to them or selling them? How is this process taking place?
Well, I would say, and I can't speak specifically to Los Angeles or that specific answer. This was a relatively generalized study summarized by the National Trust, but I would say it's probably a mix of all. But I would also say in Los Angeles, they have a different development pattern than we do here in Knoxville. And that was probably what I was going to hit next. those neighborhoods probably already had these types of middle housing in their historic neighborhoods. And so it was easier for those, they maybe were pre-existing middle housing that have just always remained as duplexes, triplexes, and quadplexes. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's just, maybe it's hard to anticipate what's going to happen.
Yeah.
But, you think this is supposed to tackle affordable housing. And if you have this increased demand for developers to come in and raise prices and make changes to these houses, then you're really not accomplishing the goal that we're setting to.
Well, I want to respond to that this is supposed to address affordable housing. This is not an affordable housing strategy per se.
Oh,
This is an opportunity to increase housing supply in a very incremental way. What a lot of people refer to as like gentle density over time. But it's not an affordable housing strategy. There's no way to ensure that what will be built if this policy is passed would be affordable, unless there's other incentives put in place to ensure that affordability.
Is that a possibility?
Yeah, I mean, it's always a possibility that there would be new programs developed, but it's something that we can require recently.
Right, yeah. Okay.
But, with respect to that too, and to your question, I don't think it's directly about affordable housing, but I think it will help with a component as in more competition. I mean, the more units, we need to get more units on the ground.
Just basic supply and demand.
Right. Yeah, the more supply is out there, the less pressure pushing upwards on rents and pricing and on homes, in my opinion, because that's the problem we've had is people are moving here, since 2008, we haven't had as much inventory hitting the ground. I mean, there's a lot of reasons, banking and COVID, and there's a lot of different reasons, but the more we increase any kind of inventory, if it's missing middle or apartments or single family, I mean, I think that pushes up the supply and eases up on pricing.
Well, I'm thinking about the very first slide that Amy and Lindsay showed, which we've seen before, but it shows that there's this bookend of either have multifamily in this high rise or you have single family, and then there's this whole middle block that is just missing. And so it really is filling this different needs for different stages of life and different needs that's just hard to come by.
Yeah, I agree. I'm sold on the whole thing. I'd like to see it expanded more, even more, in the city and possibly even into the county, the way that the zoning codes work.
That was a really good segue for me. That was a really good segue because after we talk about how it went missing, we have why, like what are the benefits to this community. So real briefly, I think when we've touched on this before, we've sort of framed it up as like what we're just discussing. There were single family houses and there were large multi-unit apartment buildings, but what we haven't really touched on is like how and why, and that is basically the whole history of zoning. So when zoning was upheld in 1926 by the Supreme Court, that basically separated single family residential use zones from all other uses. And a specific part of that decision recognized that dense housing, and very specifically was apartment buildings at that time, had the potential to be as much of a nuisance to single family neighborhoods as a factory for industrial uses. So single family, that Euclid versus Amber decision, which legalized and confirms the appropriateness of different zoning in the nation, which is a great thing. It also did sort of isolate single family neighborhoods as their own thing. So that really made it challenging to build any additional units on those. In the 1930s, federal housing policy was another aspect of this. Federal Housing Administration practices of the 1930s, including redlining, which is something that has been brought up, where the federal mortgage agencies would refuse to insure mortgages in and near Black neighborhoods. This created a sort of financial separation, but also physical separation of the types of neighborhoods that were constructed. Alongside these practices, they kind of went hand in hand, was just a general cultural trend towards the concept of the American dream as a single family house with a yard and a place to park your car when you got one. So there are a lot of factors that sort of led to that sort of middle form of housing going missing. We could talk about why we would want to incorporate these forms into Knoxville for a really long time. So this slide has like a lot of information, and we can discuss this. But one of the things that Commissioner Adams touched on was changing demographics, and we have a lot of statistics that support these. And I would just back up and say, after this workshop, we will send you guys some additional resources. We've got sort of a roundup of various links and articles to read. And we'll connect you guys with where all these came from. But a lot of this came from the East Tennessee Realtors State of Housing Report. So a lot of this is specific to Knoxville. So we've talked about the statistic that currently 40.8% of Knoxville households are single persons. And then 1 in 5 of Knoxville residents are aged 65 years or older. Since early 2020, Knoxville has had a positive net migration of approximately 22,000 people. So not only do we have more people in Knoxville, but we have more households, and we have households of different composition, from single families to families, people without children, and that directly impacts housing demand. So as the number of single person households, et cetera, increases, there's going to be a growing demand for smaller, less expensive housing options that cater to those living alone or couples, or options where people may want to have a separate unit for a relative or a family member, et cetera. We've also discussed, I think, pretty extensively the housing options side of this. So while it may not necessarily be affordable housing, we are creating new options for smaller and more attainable houses. And this is something that can provide a pathway to homeownership if people can purchase a smaller unit, sort of build their wealth through that and sell that, and then purchase something larger if that's what they want. This is something that can provide a pathway to homeownership for folks in Knoxville. This increases rental options. So we have more small scale multifamily housing. So people can, there are more access to units to rent in the neighborhoods where people want to live in Knoxville. And then homeowners have the option to add units to generate passive income and support their own housing costs. There are a significant amount of environmental benefits, and I can connect you guys with some studies, but a 2010 EPA study noted that attached housing units use less electricity and water than detached housing units. So these smaller units are typically more energy efficient. Also, obviously, they're being located in walkable units. So having more housing in walkable neighborhoods means that folks are going to drive less. Again, contributing less greenhouse gases. It's a more sustainable form of housing. Finally, this contributes to more residents using public transportation, which in turn will result in transit agencies providing more frequent service. So that's less of a reliance on private vehicle usage. So there's the environmental aspect. And finally, there's the equity aspect, and that's what you can see in the chart on the bottom right. This is from the East Tennessee Realtors Association. There are major racial disparities in homeownership, and those are based on a number of factors, from income inequality, disparities in the mortgage market, but then exclusionary zoning practices. And so,
Something you said made me think about some of the duplex, triplex options differently. I think always assumed that those would be rental scenarios, but that is not the case, correct?
that's not necessarily the case.
So there's nothing preventing, again, I'm thinking about those historic forms, in the slide that you had two old newspaper ads. That those types of forms that exist currently, I've always thought of those as being rentals, and that if someone was to build a new one similar to that they would also be rentals, but that doesn't have to be the case. They could be sold as individual units.
In condo amount.
Yeah.
And at your point, I was on a plane flying to Canada this summer, and there was a gentleman sitting next to me, and his son had just bought a house. In Canada, they have looser restrictions on zoning. And his son purposely bought this duplex so he could live in one half, rent out the other, and support his mortgage. Which I thought
Very
interesting. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, absolutely. So it's just additional options, whether it's rental or homeownership, and being able to split that is an option.
I'm bringing that up because I think, I'll just go ahead and throw it out there, that there is a lot of resistance to these ideas because of the sense that there's transience in those forms because they're rentals. And so if there's an understanding that that's not necessarily the case, that these could be purchased time out, then that might also lower some of the resistance factors of fear factors about them all being rentals.
I would echo that. I mean, just to back you up, I'd buy a townhouse downtown in a heartbeat. I'm married. It's just me and my husband, don't have a kid. I want to be close to work. It's people like me. You know, you don't want to buy a townhouse.
And the cost would make them more saleable than rentable.
True.
Is it possible to talk a little bit about form-based coding? Is that anything in the foreseeable future for this area, this activity?
We have two form-based codes in the city of Knoxville, South Waterfront and the Cumberland Avenue code. The code that we have currently, that we recently updated, like 3 years ago, is at what we consider a hybrid code. So there are elements of form-based in there, but it's not strictly form-based. I mean, there's talk from time to time of pursuing a form-based code for certain parts of the city, but there's nothing that's that way.
And I think that this, the middle housing standards draw from the concepts of form-based code. So, you know, the concept of a form-based code is regulating the building envelope and more design aspects than the uses. And so we actually have a situation now where we are going to start reviewing buildings in these residential zonings by their building footprint, so that there is integration from the form-based code that's sort of formed into this. Yeah. Okay. So we did want to give you guys like the how, but what we want to do here is give more of a high-level review of it, since we got pretty granular during agenda review in October, and we will return in December and we will go back to being granular again. We'll really dig into the nuances of the code. So I'm going to go over it in a sort of high-level form, but if folks have any questions about any of the details here, we are happy to break those down and we can get into the details if we'd like. But we were going to give that sort of high level so we can continue to have the opportunity to address some of the things that y'all asked for at the October Planning Commission meeting. So how are we trying to allow new middle housing forms in the city of Knoxville? So the proposal has a specific location, as we've discussed pretty extensively, the TDR land use area. There are applicable zoning districts, and there are forms of housing that are permitted in each of those zoning districts. We have a section of types, so we lay out the specific middle housing forms. Those are definitions that may differ from the base zoning code, but the definition section in the zoning code is going to refer back to the middle housing forms. So these will only apply to these specific projects. The types have an emphasis on height, scale, and design features. Then we have a uses section, so that's sort of the chart that you can see on the right. We lay out which of the types are permitted based on the zoning district and their conformance to the standards. And then we get into these standards. So there's a new table that establishes dimensional standards for middle housing types. It supersedes the dimensional standards in table 4.1 of the residential code. So that's something that you're probably familiar with: building coverage, impervious surface coverage, setbacks, etc. And the dimensional standards here regulate the forms by the minimum lot width. So we'll get back to that when we discuss the testing that our staff have done. The minimum lot with or without an alley, acknowledging that possible need for a driveway access. There's a maximum building width and depth. There's a setbacks, and there's maximum height in stories. We have parking standards, and then there are design standards that are intended to guide the construction of new buildings that are similar in footprint, height, and placement to the block, but allow for flexibility in design and generate visual interest. We're not trying to specifically prescribe what these houses should look like exactly, but really the intent of the design standards is just that they are able to incorporate in the streetscape without being disproportionate or really stick out like a sore thumb. So the how in all of this is pretty specific, and it's tailored to the lots in the neighborhoods. And I think we'll talk a little bit more about these standards once we show you guys the results of the testing. But is there anything on this that anybody would like to hit? Yeah.
So someone can buy two adjacent lots and combine them
Yes.
to qualify for them.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. They can. Okay. Other thoughts on this one? We'll get it. A Okay. So another section of the code is conversions. And this is one tactic that is intended to incentivize use of our existing housing stock. So there are standards that allow conversions of existing buildings to middle housing types via interior renovation or additions. And the available types would correspond with table 4.3. So that's the permitted types in the zones. So this is kind of the blanket summary that y'all have heard at agenda review in the Planning Commission. I'll just kind of summarize. These have design standards that are relatively simple, but they guide where the additions can be placed. So you're not going to have a situation where someone's building an addition on the front of the house. The additions are for the side and the rear. Dormers can allow for additional height via a half story. But again, these design standards for additions would stress compatibility in height and scale. And then the framework we've given before, I think it can be easier and quicker to build an addition than remove a house and construct a new unit. It can be less expensive than building an entire new house, and it's definitely more sustainable. So the benefit here is that it conserves all that embodied energy, and there's less construction waste going to a landfill. That's sort of the why that we've discussed before, but one thing we heard was a lot of discussion on this topic at the Planning Commission meeting and at council workshops, so we did want to kind of unpack this further, because we wanted to discuss it in a little more detail. So some of the aspects of conversions are already permitted within the base zoning via the special use process, but there are fewer design guardrails and there are more parking requirements. So, for example, in the RN1 or the RN2 zoning district, a property owner can already convert their single family house to a duplex, but outside of the middle housing standards, they may be able to achieve this through means that are less compatible with the neighborhood. So they could have a one-story house like that minimal traditional I showed in the beginning and build a two-story addition that sort of towers over it on the rear, or other elements that are somewhat incompatible with the streetscape. And then they would also be required to add at least 2 parking spaces. So then that would be 4 parking spaces on that site, which is a lot of pavement. And generally going to make these projects a lot more difficult. The other element that I think I'm always going to hit, being originally the historic preservation planner, is the concept of conversions is now officially supported by federal historic preservation policy. So the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation is the federal agency that oversees historic preservation. They released a policy statement in September on housing and historic preservation, how historic neighborhoods could support the housing crisis that our nation has. And they very specifically reference this in policy statement 4. So they say public serving institutions should promote zoning codes that encourage greater density of housing in tandem with preserving historic buildings and legalize housing in historic neighborhoods where it's now prohibited. Many zoning codes were put into place at a time when urban density was all too often a negative and something to be legislated against. But increasing density in existing residential neighborhoods is a potential solution to address the shortfall in housing supply, and changes should be seriously explored. And then they say, real specifically, consideration should be given to allowing and incentivizing density without demolition through conversion of historic single-family dwellings to multifamily dwellings. And then they also acknowledge the need for compatible infill construction of multifamily housing on vacant parcels in historic district. So I think this is important to hit because there are, people have concerns about the effect on historic neighborhoods, but this overarching historic preservation policy from the federal to the nonprofit end really supports this, recognizes that these neighborhoods are supported to these forms. Another point is that some of these conversions that have already been completed in the early to mid 20th century contributed to the preservation of historic houses in Knoxville effectively. This was a point that a Park Ridge resident shared with Cheryl and shared with someone from Knox Heritage. They said, basically, some of the houses in their neighborhood probably wouldn't have made it had they not been able to hold multiple units at some point in their history. So I have an image of Fort Sanders on the screen here, which I know sometimes is a challenging example because it can be a pretty dicey situation, but it's indicative of this. So from the 1910s, when actually my great-great-grandmother had a house on Laurel Avenue, she rented out individual rooms as a boarding house, to the 1980s when we wildly overestimated the people that were going to come for the World's Fair and we cut these up into apartments. The fact that a lot of these houses are able to still exist because we could change the insides of them to accommodate additional housing units. However, On the flip side, now we're working with contemporary building codes, so we have that benefit. This is going to ensure safety as opposed to the haphazard sort of cut up apartments that I think a lot of us would envision when we think about the things particularly done in the 70s and 80s. But they'll ensure safety through fire separation requirements in duplexes, sprinklers in triplexes, and accessibility requirements in quadplexes. And we have additional research completed on this. Brian has sort of done a survey of the codes, and we can kind of talk about this further if people have concerns about that. But the point here is that these new building codes that we're working with, they also may make conversions challenging and somewhat cost prohibitive if you're stepping above a duplex. Someone would really have to work pretty hard to accommodate a triplex or a quadplex in a lot of these single family houses, just because they will have to sprinkler, provide accessibility requirements, etc. So that's safety, and it's also sort of a protection guardrail there. Does anybody have thoughts or questions on conversions?
Well, I think that was one of the, at least I think it was, they were out of Fort Sanders and Fort McGill area that at the meeting they were upset about. They were okay with building new ones, but where they were having the rub was the conversions. Because and I'm just going by memory here, but I think they were saying that, gosh, we just converted them to single family away from the density, and they felt like that was better for the neighborhood. And now you're kind of wanting to go back to it. And I'm not saying I'm for it or against it. I'm just, saying that was some feedback, I think, at the meeting. One of the reasons it got slowed down a little bit, I think. So I just throwing it out for discussion or.
Well, I appreciate what Lindsay said about the kind of flip on perspective that these houses wouldn't even exist today.
Right.
Had they not had the chock-a-block sort of treatment. That was terrible, but it actually meant that the structure remained. I hadn't thought about it from that perspective. And the fact that you were saying someone has to work really hard to get to a triplex or quadruplex with all the sprinklering and stuff, that too, I think, is a mitigating factor. A duplex seems a lot less intense. I would think for a Fourth and Gill or something than something beyond that, because you might even have to add I know there are guidelines here, but add a half story or something to that nature to get what you needed. I just question when we were talking about it in that meeting, how much the neighbors that were bringing up those issues understood about these two ideas, the increased safety codes, and then that the buildings are still here because of some of those activities.
I think, at least in student housing too, I mean, you're seeing a lot of things, everything is rented by the room now. It's not even like, you've got a 3-bedroom, 2-bath home, standard West Knoxville kind of Knox boxy thing. But especially in these areas, they just chop them up inside. They'll have one kitchen, and they rent these things for $1,000 or $1,500 per room. So that I don't know what that is considered. Is it still considered one house? Or I don't know how that's viewed. And also, question about that too. Like we've had a lot of discussions about ADUs lately as well. Is this? Can you do both? I mean, you do the duplex in front and put an ADU in the back or 3. Just work it out.
I mean, I think about, it's like, we just converted these back to single family residence. We just got it restored. So everything's good. But why is that good? I mean, what was wrong with multi-unit single family converted houses to begin with?
I don't think there's anything wrong with it. I think it's a market.
The perception of we just fixed it back to a single family, I think, is kind of flawed because the entire, take Fourth and Gill, for example, the deterioration of those homes on the exterior isn't because they were multifamily. There were wider economic trends hitting, inner city areas with the interstate being constructed. It wasn't because they were multifamily that they deteriorated. It was other economic forces, I would argue. So I think the resistance of, they could be converted and then they're going to become dilapidated is really just not true.
I think it feeds into the transience factor. That sentiment that was articulated about, well, now it's good because it's single family.
70s and 80s,
that it wasn't as much about now it's single family, therefore not bad, but it's single family, so someone is invested here and is going to stay here and keep it this way, as opposed to if it's owned by one person who's a distant landlord and they're not concerned about the welfare of the students there. That's what they moved from. I didn't take it to mean that it had to be single family to be good, but I took it to mean that's the only safety mechanism that the neighborhood has had success with in having a home be restored and cared for.
I think we're just dealing with the unfortunate reality that people's perception of multifamily homes in Knoxville, while the Fort is a great example of what can be done with historic homes, anybody from Fourth and Gill, Old North looking at the Fort is going, oh God, I don't want that to be my neighborhood. And I think we just have to deal with the reality that people automatically associate that kind of construction with the Fort, which is what it is, and it's great for UT in my opinion, but it's not going to work everywhere, but it's not going to be that way everywhere. But I think that's people's mindset.
If you go through the Fort now, I mean, John Holmes has fixed how many properties that are multifamily, that are in historic homes. I mean, that's from the exterior, I think they look good, and there are a lot of units in them. So.
Well, I think also,
I'm not sure what
having a number of bedrooms is different than what we're talking about here. Cutting up a house and adding additional bedrooms is not what we would refer to as middle housing.
Mm-hmm.
There's a distinction there. So I don't know that the Ford is a best example of what we're talking about. And I think it also, going back to it's missing, we don't have a lot of great examples of what this looks like.
I think the idea, if I may interject really quick, with conversions is that they wouldn't be individual, fully housed units.
Mm-hmm.
That it wouldn't be specifically rooms.
Yes.
We wouldn't really allow that. I mean, it would have to be its own contained specific unit, i.e., bathroom, kitchen. It doesn't have to have multiple bedrooms. It could be an efficiency, but that it would be its own unit versus individual rooms.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Okay. Other thoughts? All right. So Amy's going to touch on some process aspects now, which I think is another topic that we got pretty into in October.
So I think it's important to note that using the proposed middle housing standards is voluntary. In all the zoning districts covered by the middle housing standards, applicants may opt instead to follow the base zoning and the special use review process that might apply. Administrative variations provide relief from standards due to existing conditions on the site, provided that all the other standards are met, such as lot width, corner, side setbacks, design standards that can achieve creative design. Previous iterations of the code did not permit variances under Article 16.3 to the middle housing section of the code. So the revised proposal to be heard at the December meeting will allow consideration of variances related to parking, because we've heard a lot of discussion around parking and the challenges associated with that.
Can you say that again? What was that?
So previous iterations of the code, the one that's currently was currently before you all, did not permit any variances under Article 16.3.
That was just because of the BZA process being removed, or why was that?
It was to allow for, because this is optional. Like, this is not required. Like, you don't have to pursue the middle housing standards. You can always just utilize the base zone standards. Pursuing this other option, there's additional standards that fall into place. The bar is set a little bit higher if you want to add create a duplex on your lot or a triplex.
The bar is set higher if you do the middle.
Yes, it is.
But doesn't it seem like it's looser with like the landscape buffer and the
It's allowing more options for property owners to utilize their property in different ways, but when they move forward with, for example, construction of hypothetically a new structure, such as a duplex in this TDR area, if they follow this middle housing process, they have design and dimensional standards that don't specifically exist. It is a little bit like what the product would be would actually potentially have to go through a little bit more review.
Yeah, so for instance,
Okay.
so Lindsay's already touched on this, but there's more emphasis on the height, the scale, the design, the compatibility with the surrounding neighborhoods. Those types of things come into play.
Building width and depth,
Building
which
width
is
and depth is
something that
important.
we do not typically regulate. We're just building a duplex in the RN2 through the existing special use process. There are not guardrail, well, there are in terms of setbacks and building coverage and stuff, but the dimensional standards also regulate the footprints of the houses, the maximum footprint of the house or, dwelling that can be built on that property.
So a key concept, going back to middle housing, is intended to be house scale buildings. And so these standards are designed to ensure that they remain house scale buildings. There's lots of places that you can build a multi-unit building that would be out of context with our neighborhoods. That's not the intent of the middle housing standards.
Gotcha. Okay, that makes sense.
This is one thing, Amy pointed out, that we don't have a lot of good examples of this. Like, we're struggling here to point to something that is really an apple to an apple, and we have examples that are not great, like Fort Sanders.
Mhm.
And I think that is one reason why the current designation of the TDR for this MMH makes a lot of sense, because it gives us a test bed to be able to see good examples so that it can grow from that. To me, that seems like good rationale for why there's been a border drawn, as opposed to just going ahead to the entire city. Because there's people who just don't understand what it is. We had some good examples.
So I wanted to touch on appeals. Is any person, and you all know this, I know, but any person can appeal a planning staff decision to this body. And then any decision that the planning commission makes is appealable. So if it's in the city, it's going to be appealable to city council. And if it's in the county, it will be either appealable to county commission or the BCA. So I just wanted to clarify that. So there are different steps, checks and balances that will not go away. Planning staff, if this is passed, will take the lead on development review of projects that take advantage of the middle housing. We have precedent for this, for how we run reviews for EN, established neighborhoods, downtown Knoxville Edge District, the RN4 zoning districts, along with the design review overlays historic zoning commission, as well as in middle housing. We'll have a standardized application form and required supporting documentation. We will provide ongoing staff assistance. I will say that we do that for any project, but again, specifically for things like this, where there's additional standards in place, we want to make sure that we make the process as easy as possible, and both the applicant and the community members understand what's happening and what's allowed and what's not allowed. We'll provide public notice, and then we also are committed to making sure, to Commissioner Adams' point, collecting data and monitoring changes over time, see what the impacts are, the effects are, and if it does make sense to potentially expand it further. Any questions about the process as proposed currently?
And are you gonna talk about BZAs? Like, wasn't there something where they weren't allowed to appeal to BZA?
Yes. So for the variances, yes, there's what we call administrative variations, which can be relieved to the standards based on existing conditions of the site. But in terms of varying, it's not like you can go in and ask for, and I might ask Christina to jump in on this one. The intent is this is an optional. So if this doesn't work for you, say the site's not big enough for you to do a duplex or a triplex, this is not intended to just allow you to go to BZA and say, we still want to do this. Well, you might be able to do that with the base zone. So that would be the default. So you still are allowed to utilize your property without requesting a variance. The one thing that we are proposing to add is variances for parking, because we know that's a significant challenge, in particular in our older neighborhoods, of providing accommodation for required parking. due to site constraints.
So that would be like a
Anything-
setback example. So like if the setback is 5 and you want to do missing middle, a quadplex, let's say, and you're like, oh, my hardship is the lot is too narrow.
Mhm.
You can't request a BZA variance of like 2 foot setback.
Not
for
to
missing middle.
get this particular development installed.
Because
That's exactly right. We don't want the variances to become something that people use to increase density or, like you said, go farther into a setback requirement, which may become out of context with the neighborhood. That's the main concern there. And so that's why, with the middle housing standards and dimensional requirements that we have, just like Amy said, you can use those for middle housing developments, and that's how we're going to encourage it because there's a little bit more leeway there. But if that doesn't work for you, you still have the option of just going with the base dimensional requirements and standards. We just don't want there to be a way around the higher level of flexibility, I guess, for lack of a better word, that the middle housing standards provide by going even farther to get the variance and take it more to an extreme. We're trying to get away from those, extremely high density multifamily. We're trying to stay in the middle.
Yeah, so creating structures that again are not house scale buildings.
Exactly.
Say they wanted to build something that is a building, they're like, I can't make, let me pull a number up. I can't make a 35-foot wide building work, or a 40-foot wide duplex, 45-foot wide fourplex. I need it to be 55 feet. They couldn't go get a variance for that. So again, that they could not go to the BZA to increase the scale that we have set in these dimensional standards.
But they could go specific.
Yes.
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 Can you explain? You said it a couple of times that they could use their property. So they, using it in the general code.
Under the base zone.
Yes.
Right. So they can do whatever is allowed in the base zone according to the uses and the dimensional requirements and all those standards that are included there. They can still opt for that because the zoning hasn't changed. We're just saying that, if you are in the TDR area and, you have a lot that accommodates this and you can meet all of the requirements in the middle housing code, you could do that if you wanted to. So, but you have the option either way.
Does that make sense? We also want to provide an opportunity to address the concerns and feedback provided that October Planning Commission meeting related to outreach and engagement. So I'm gonna run through a few slides. As I mentioned, Cheryl's here, and her office has been leading the public engagement. But I want to kind of go back a little bit further to before this started, before we had these standards drafted. As you all remember, back in September of 2022, Opticos, the consultant that we hired, so this was a collaboration between planning, the East Tennessee Realtors Association, and the city, came in and did what was called a middle housing scan, just looked at our code and our plans, and provided some recommendations for us. In October, we had a workshop, we presented at your agenda review, overview of that scan. We had representatives from Opticos at the agenda review. And then there was also in the spring, in March, there were 2 workshops. There was one at the East Tennessee Realtors Association that also included Opticos. And then there was a city council workshop. That's where the formal proposal was given to staff to pursue standards for middle housing and how that might apply in the city of Knoxville. In September of this year, we had a city council workshop, and then of course today. There's been a number of meetings with neighborhood associations, nonprofits. There's been a number of one-on-one meetings that Ms. Paul and her team have undertaken, and there's 2 community open houses, which I know some of you attended, and there were quite a few people who came out for those, around 150 folks. These are some additional groups and organizations that have been engaged throughout this process. And these are some neighborhood needs. And Cheryl, I don't know if there's anything you want to touch on here or provide an overview.
I would be happy to take questions. I attended almost all of these myself personally. There's a couple that I had to divide and conquer because they're at the same time, but for the most part, I have attended all of these. We do continue to have folks reach out to the mayor's office and my office to ask questions. Want to get clarification. They want to know, how does this affect my property? How does this affect my neighbor's property? And how does it affect my neighborhood? And those are the three things that they most want to know. And those are very individualized engagement opportunities that we take very seriously and have attempted to make sure we're giving everyone the answers to the questions that they're looking for. Most of the time, they're satisfied. But as you all are very aware, some people don't like the answer that they get. But for the most part, folks are really pleased to see that the city being methodical, that we work with the planning staff to be intentional about the approach that we've taken with this. And for the most part, they applaud. It was a very small meeting on Monday night, but they applauded. It was 15 people there, and they were like, "Yay!" And I'm like,
Never happens.
but I mean, it's great news. It's great news. It's very exciting. This was a group of neighborhoods in East Knoxville. They were really pleased, about the approach that we're taking, and so I'll be happy to entertain any questions that you all have.
Any questions or comments about the community outreach? Again, that came up as a question during the planning commission meeting. There was interest in, the team continuing to do more outreach.
Yes, Cheryl, in your meetings, people are scared to change often. So have they ever brought up, or have you discussed with them other options that could help what they would see as protect the integrity of their neighborhoods, like
Were you
expand?
at a couple of these?
No, but like adding new neighborhood conservation overlays or historic overlays.
In particular neighborhoods that are a little more organized and savvy with understanding zoning and use, yes. There have been multiple that have had some conversation about, do we need to pursue this? What will be the process? I have handed out Lindsay's name and email address more than once as a great resource to support them, but also have had making sure that if a neighborhood is going to take it on to do something like that, because that is a pretty significant undertaking, to really make sure that they understand, and Lindsay is great about helping them understand this, but since I have the opportunity, sometimes in that moment with a group of people to send that message is, let's talk with your city council representative as well. Let's bring that person into the fold in the process as you initiate having these conversations. And so far, I don't know if anyone is actually pursuing that. I don't think Lindsay's received any phone calls, but trying to make sure that they do understand there is a process that they can go through to create a different level of protection if that's something that they desires to do.
Yeah, and I just want to clarify, particularly for some of your commissioners, what Nathaniel had asked about was additional design review protection, so like a historic district or a neighborhood conservation overlay, which some people may think about change and new buildings being built on vacant lots and think, is there more that could be done to review how they look and fit in the neighborhood? So that was what we talked about.
Any other questions or comments about that? Thank you, Cheryl. I'm going to turn it over to.
Okay, I think
Oh,
I have one
oh,
question.
oh, yes.
So I guess I really like this idea. I'm not trying to drive a wrench into anything, but the one discussion about demolishing a couple of houses in order to accomplish a larger scale middle housing. Like, I mean, how does that happen? They would have to buy 2 lots. They would have to go through the process. I mean, this is someone who doesn't have an overlay, correct? If they had an overlay, they couldn't demolish.
Properties that have a historic or a neighborhood conservation overlay demolition is reviewed by the Historic Zoning Commission. And I will say that folks proposing the demolition are expected to provide a substantial amount of information to support why they could not retain and preserve that house. And I can give you so many examples, including when the city most recently proposed a demolition and the Historic Zoning Commission said no. That's where the demolition review comes in. Properties that are in the infill housing overlay do not have a demolition review as part of that process right now. We have another form of guardrail for demolition review. Claims the historic preservation planner is the title referenced in the code, review every demolition permit that's pulled in the city for historic significance. And there is a 60-day delay of demolition that's intended to mitigate the loss of a historic structure. So those are for historic buildings that are locally significant but may not have formal designation. And that just allows additional time for conversations with the property owner, for advocacy organizations like Knoxville to get involved. Mitigation and documentation of the building before it's removed is what typically happens. So there are multiple layers of review of demolition. That's not to say that someone could not do what you're talking about. So someone could buy some adjacent lots and houses on them and demolish them if they weren't in a historic or a neighborhood conservation overlay. Will it be financially feasible and effective for them to do that? Maybe not. I don't necessarily have that data, and I'm not a contractor and don't have that kind of stuff, but they could technically do that.
But they can do that now.
They can do
In
that.
absence of the middle housing standards.
This does not impact that.
Yeah.
This does not impact whether or not a property owner makes the decision to demolition something on their property or not. It just doesn't have any impact on that.
Does it have an impact on it? And this is a question for you about what you heard from all of these meetings, because it seems like the impact that it could have is that there's now more of an incentive to do this, that because you could build something larger or something that housed more persons, that there could be a desire there. Was that something that you saw neighbors expressing concern about? And if so, how did that dialogue go?
It did come up more than once. Most certainly, it came up at our community outreach events as well as a topic. It's one of those things that is a little hard for us to, as you said earlier, I do not have a crystal ball. I cannot always predict the future. We do not feel, one of the reasons to have the conversion standards is to prevent demolition. I mean, that is the primary focus and reason to have it. It's considered a best practice across the country to have conversion standards. So we did some research on our side because there's been such a heavy lift on the part of the planning team to not just do some online research, but literally make some phone calls to some cities that have implemented different zoning changes related to middle housing, because you can only find so much online about what's actually happening. And so getting on the phone with several cities across the Southeast has been really great for helping us to identify what's actually happening now that this is in place. And they're just not seeing demolitions happen. What they're seeing is more infill lot, for not official infill overlay, but like infill lots being utilized for middle housing. That's what is happening more traditionally across the Southeast. And that is, the bad news is no one's tracking it. No one is tracking exactly what's happening in their municipality or in any capacity, which is something we fully intend to change should we have the opportunity to do this. We should definitely be doing significant data tracking. But so what we're getting is from those city officials their anecdotal response to what they're seeing happen and what they're approving through plans review, what they're seeing happen through their zoning process, et cetera. So while we don't know, and I mean, just in fairness, demolitions are happening now in the city of Knoxville to build new housing. It is happening. It does happen. This is not specifically going to prevent that. I think whether the money works out, because somebody who's going to do that, it's going to be about whether whether they can pencil this, whether their pro forma is going to work to make this happen. That's what it's going to.
Can I pose a hypothetical that I think Amy's kind of going with? It would be like, so Oakwood Lincoln Park, 2 50-foot wide lots that are currently single family homes zoned RN2. So under this proposal, the biggest building that could be done is a quad, right? In RN2. So what is the planning staff review if someone comes in and buys 2 50-foot wide lots, demolishes them? They're still limited to a maximum of a 45-foot wide building on a 100-foot wide lot now. But would that be reviewed as if all of the other homes around it are still single-family residences or duplex at most? Does the staff review allow denial of a quad in that? Does that make sense?
Yes.
I think it is.
Potential, I mean, staff can deny if it's out of context. It's not in keeping with the adopted code. It's out of context with the neighborhood. It's not house scale. Yes.
But I also can't imagine a situation where someone would buy 2 50-foot wide lots, go to the effort of demolishing the single-family houses on those that are selling for a pretty decent deal at this point, and then not building 2 quadplexes on them, combining the lot and building one right in the middle seems like that would give you less of a financial benefit than building 2 of the middle housing forms that you could build on there.
Because a quadplex can be built on.
Or
Whichever one.
Well, the lot width requirement is 55 feet. So that's why it's not 2.
That brings us to the testing and some of the modifications that we may make.
Commissioner Hodges, did you get your
please.
question answered?
Yeah, that's fine, thank you.
Okay.
Appreciate that.
Okay, I'm going to turn it back over to Lindsay, who's going to go over the testing that staff has done.
And that brings us to another good segue. Okay. So one of the other things that we heard at the Planning Commission meeting was that commissioners and people were concerned that this stuff had not been tested. And we went through, so in this postponement period, we had the opportunity to go through a testing period for all of the dimensional standards. So Samuel in our office really took the lead on this, and being relatively new to our office, we were really excited to have him because he has really extensive architectural design and SketchUp and GIS skills, so we got to make use of that. And so if I'm talking at any point and you want to clarify or jump in around anything, let me know. But so basically the process involved a 3D visualization on SketchUp. And what Samuel went through and did was test the minimum lot width for each of these dimensional standards, and then test that as it compared to the maximum building depth. We can pull up that actual chart itself and discuss that. But so what he wanted to make sure was that the buildings would basically work on the lots. We had to set some basic parameters for the testing. So we did an average lot depth of 120 feet. You know, often we think about that 50 by 150 feet wide or deep, 15 feet wide by 150 feet deep lot as a standard. But what Samuel found when looking at the few existing middle housing situations that we have in the TDR land use area was that they actually were on lots even more shallow than that 150. So we wanted to see if they could even work on something like that. We set typical front setbacks and average story heights, and then tested scenarios with and without the alley. And we'll run through these and we can show you guys this kind of stuff. But basically the findings were that these dimensional standards worked within the test lots. The main issue that we found is that the maximum building width is not always possible with the minimum lot width, which when you think about that a little bit more, that's actually okay. If someone is buying a lot that is, say, 45 feet wide or 45 feet wide, and they may not have to accommodate the maximum building width. They can go smaller than that. So that encourages people to continue to build buildings that are compatible with this streetscape. The other one that we'll find that you'll see in these some of these examples that I'm going to show you guys is that parking is a significant factor. Even with the reductions of 1 to 1 dwelling unit or 1 space per dwelling unit, obviously parking makes some of these challenging. So people may not always be developing the maximum building width and the maximum building depth. So we have some examples of the testing results. Samuel went through and did both options with or without an alley and showed the parking configurations and how the access would work there. Just some examples to show you guys are a stacked duplex. And then we have a fourplex where I wanted to call out, we actually tested a reduced minimum lot width. So a lot of the feedback we heard from, in particular, architects in the community was that there are the few fourplexes that exist are actually on lots smaller than a 55-foot wide lot. And they were like, why can't you do this? Why can't you make it smaller? So we tested a smaller lot and we found that that did actually work. And so that will most likely be incorporated into the revised dimensional standards in front of y'all in December. Yeah, so that's something it's a benefit. We've been able to make some revisions to the dimensional standards. And Samuel can speak to this too. We also had to really, it made us really think about our parking standards. There were some revisions that will be made to the parking standards section. In particular, there's a section of the code right now that for properties with an alley, a duplex can back out into an alley, but that triplex and fourplex, which used to fit into that multifamily kind of bucket, could not. But a townhouse could. So what we will be proposing is that a triplex and a fourplex can back out into an alley. So that allows people and incentivizes people using this alley as opposed to having to orient it off the street. Is that cool? Yeah.
Question, was accessible parking considered in this study with triplexes and quadplexes?
I didn't particularly look into that. But I think can be fit into public or more placement and make the building depth lesser than what I have shown in here.
Okay. I have a few questions that I can wait on, but that is something that I think needs to be a consideration. But we can talk about it.
Yeah.
What did this calculate up the impervious surface area with parking and the building footprint?
It is not really fitting out here. So I have the driveway or parking area and we have the building footprint section. So that's it.
Because the original zoning impervious area is still in place, or does this have a different amount?
This may have a different amount.
The impervious area coverage?
So the dimensional standards in table 4.1, those are superseded by the dimensional standards in the Middle Housing Code if you were working within this framework. So that includes building and impervious coverage.
But the new standards don't have coverage, so by not having it, it doesn't mean it defaults to the original, it just means it doesn't apply.
Correct.
Okay.
There is not. Okay. We can keep talking about this, and we'll share these with you guys afterwards too, so you have the capacity to say do the impervious math or whatnot. And so we tested all of the forms. I'm just kind of going through like a 2468 just for convenience. I don't think we necessarily need to do those, but we tested townhouses, and then we also went up to the multiplex aspect here. So some of the examples, it really did make us recognize revisions that needed to be made to the parking standards, but also some minor things to the dimensional standards. One of the things with the townhouses that Samuel pointed out was, again, attempting to max out some of these units. In particular with the townhouses, it would make for relatively narrow units. Again, that's not necessarily a problem because that means that someone can just do one less and have a wider unit. So that's, another element that we found there. Were there other items or issues that you think we should bring up here?
I think it covered that. Initially we tried without backing out into the alleys for practice and fourplexes, and we realized that makes it challenging. Then we decided that having that position would be helpful to have more building footprint.
And engineering.
Mm-hmm.
Check them out.
Yeah. Oh yeah, we didn't just make it up.
Did all of these use the dimensional standards for parking, like the 26-foot drive aisle and everything?
Yeah, in all of them except for the multiplex that I use because it's just hard to fit within the minimum lot width that I fit.
Yeah.
But yeah, these are 26 feet.
So on that one, it did not include, did you say?
Yes, so the multiplex that you see on the left, I think it has 24, it's 24 feet, not 26.
Okay.
So in the minimum lot width, we cannot pursue this parking layout. It has to be different, and I guess that would make it more challenging to have a larger building.
And that was one of the reasons why we went back and made a revision allowing for parking variances.
Okay.
Okay, did you say that there was no impervious restrictions on these lots? So that they don't have, there's no standards on that? So they could cement the whole parking lot, the whole lot? And if we were gonna do parking variances, would you consider adding some impervious guidelines on there and then so they could reduce the parking? We would just think that they could get away with not having any kind of green space.
But if they're getting a variance for parking, it's for flats.
Yeah.
Yes, so they could put more landscaping in green space than having to feel like they got 8 spaces. No?
Which is sort of the motivation behind the idea of variance for parking.
And reducing it to
one parking space per unit. But we've already said, one per unit, which is half of what is currently required. So,
And from a triplex up, we do have the requirement of a minimum 5 feet setback off the property lines. And where there are landscape buffers applicable in the parking code, they are they can be reduced to 5 feet, but there will be some landscaping around there. Another planner in our office has brought up, and we hope to bring something in front of you guys, references to the tree canopy. This is a plan that's going to be involved in the urban forestry master plan. And so we'd like to bring something that is related to preservation of existing trees on the property as well. So these are elements that we are still considering and kind of working through with that.
So there's not anything about impervious that could be because you're still working through consideration of landscaping? Yes.
we do not currently have anything planned for impervious requirements. It's one of those things that is, while we philosophically get it, it isn't always practical with this particular type of housing and the geographic area that we're looking at and the size of those lots. And so it's one of those things that is not necessarily encouraged if we can't justify it.
We also have side, front, and rear setbacks.
Yeah.
So there's still the regulation of the building width on the lot.
You can't just pave over and build over the entire lot. That would not be allowed.
The parking also has 5-foot setbacks.
Yes.
As well, so the parking can go to the edges. But one of the things that I looked at, I took a lot of lots and pulled together a bunch of data and realized that under current impervious requirements, about 51% of the RN2, RN3, RN4 lots in the zip code that I was looking at, with RN2 under the current impervious area restrictions would only, if they were doing a triplex with the amount of parking that they would have to do, it would only leave 630 square feet on average left for building footprint. So it makes sense because the impervious area on that is like 30%, I think, in RN2. So there's definitely, it makes sense to remove that with still having the setbacks in there as a protection.
I'm not trying to shortchange this conversation because we need to do this very badly, but just a question about when the adjustments and changes that are being made and have been made, when those will be available for our body and the public to look at.
We hope to have them available very soon. I mean, I don't think that we're making any major changes to what's been proposed.
It's primarily just parking related aspects. Again, we have recognized that some of these forms can fit within a minimum lot width, in particular the fourplex and possibly the multiplex.
And we want to make sure that we take into consideration comments that we made today, but also any feedback that Cheryl and her team have been hearing from the visit with these groups. Reevaluate.
When you show the updated version, is it possible to clearly indicate where changes have been made?
Like a red line version.
Yes.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely.
What was the reason for, with this one specifically, the with an alley and without an alley both being the same? Completely for that. What if that works better in this case? Would it also work better in the other zones?
I think we just chose to test it on a 50-foot lot because we heard that pushback about the lot width on this specific housing form. So the answer to your second question is maybe, but we do want to recognize that, you're having at least a 10-foot wide driveway on that site. So
If there is an alley, then they have to use it.
yes.
So the one without the alley, the setback, is that going to be on the other side of that drive, or is that drive considered a setback? So would there be green space on the other side of that driveway?
Or can the driveway be within the side setback?
Yeah.
Did we unpack that one?
Is the question related to, is there landscaping required? For
On the other side of the driveway.
Does that driveway need a 5-foot setback?
Yeah,
So-
that's because the parking meets the 5-foot setback.
Right,
So
parking, not the driveway.
So the driveway does not need a setback.
So in this instance, would that driveway actually need to, when it got to the parking area, then have a setback kind of curve into the parking? Since the, let's look at the middle one where the driveway runs all the way along the side. The parking area, I would assume, is considered where the stalls are as well as the drive aisle behind it. So would you actually be able to put a driveway along the side property line all the way back, or would it need to step back when it reached the parking?
Historically, you do that. Okay. So it's related to parking stalls. It's not true.
And that's currently, excuse me, Brian, that is currently how the code is.
I got a question, jumping back to the impervious area discussion real quick. Have there been any discussions with city engineering about the impervious side? I mean, mainly from a stormwater runoff perspective. And I mean, if we're going so impervious, then it's going to create more flow, faster flow into the existing system. I know somewhere as I've read it, I don't remember what it is, but do we know how many lots are available there was a number in RE2, R3, R4. There's actually X amount of vacant lots that could be done, so it may be a redundant question. It might be so small anyway. But theoretically, if they come in and convert everything and build out the remaining lots with the missing middle, how does that affect stormwater runoff? Is the question. Or has it been
Did
even
you all have
asked?
that conversation with city engineer? I believe I talked to you all. We can have that conversation.
We've had conversations around it. I think it's still uncertain. All the scenarios.
We sort of feel like, based on what we can see and what we see as those vacant lots that you're referencing, it's still, I don't want to sound like a broken record, but it still appears to us that this is really going to be very incremental, and that this is not, and that's not what is happening across the country either, but it's absorbable with our current infrastructure. And we also had, going out to these meetings, you hear lots of, the topics are not limited to just the thing that you are there to present about. So we get lots of other things started in the mix, and KUB capacity is one of the things that has also come up. We've sat down with KUB 3 times to go over the geographic area to talk about their capacity as well, and they have a lot of confidence about their capacity to be able to support some housing.
Sure. Yeah, and I'm not saying I have a problem with any of it. I'm just kind of approaching the question as it is incrementally done. It will incrementally increase the stormwater runoff.
Absolutely.
So that's more of a comment.
Well, and so we will share the package with you guys, and then if you have additional questions, you can reach out to myself and someone as well.
I have some questions about the parking, but I can wait if there's another step or something else to.
We have one more topic kind of to cover, and then we can definitely do some broader parking conversations, but also I think it would be beneficial for you to, we want to hear that from you for sure. And if that has to be individually or that's good too, because those are good specific ones. Do you compare?
Yeah.
Do you want to?
And we wanted to cover peer meeting with you all because it came up as a topic that you all wanted us to take a look at. Like, what has been going on? What are their communities? What have you all seen? What have you all been? Cheryl's already touched on that, but our staff as well did a deeper dive.
Okay. Yeah, so that was one of the topics we heard, and we've done a pretty extensive review via, research, but also then, as Cheryl was saying, we direct conversations with other municipalities. And I have a spreadsheet of research that has a lot of links, so you can really go as deep into this as you want, and we'll share this with you guys. We wanted to just touch on a couple of the aspects of it and, some of the data that's available associated with it. So there are 2 real landmark decisions in middle housing, and these are the ones you may have heard about on the news, and they occurred in Minneapolis and in Portland in 2020 and then 2021 respectively. We're just touching on these as these are sort of the initial ones that happened, and these are ones that were really big programs that happened citywide, and that's not what we're proposing here. Minneapolis accomplished theirs via a comprehensive plan and then a code that responded to that. They allowed up to triplexes in all residential zoning districts citywide. This also included amendments to the parking code, regulations for lot combinations and subdivisions in lower density districts, and then a built form overlay district, which has development review design standards that are very location specific. In Portland, they instituted a new code, which increased just blanket over the city an increase of allowable units per lot based on the location. They also had design and dimensional standards. The point of these 2 is you hear about them a lot in the news, and you hear a lot of their information cited because these were the major citywide sort of groundbreaking ones, but they are really multifaceted projects. So there is a new comprehensive plan, but there's also code amendments, and they're really sort of a big overarching thing that happened. Because these were 2 of the earliest adopters of citywide policies, they have data that's real easily accessible. And so the first one in Minneapolis, they have reported this construction data from 2020 to 2022. And you can see there how many duplexes and triplexes were permitted. And it's really surprising, but also not surprising how small of a number that is. It's 64 duplexes and 21 triplexes. Obviously, the most common type was a duplex. Portland does an annual report, so their most recent one had construction data from the fiscal year 2022, August 21 to July 22. That was 34 duplexes permitted, and then surprisingly, the most common type was fourplexes. There were 204, and then just to compare, there were 78 single-family houses that were permitted in that year. So there are other municipalities, and I can connect you guys with these. Other municipalities have reporting practices that we really will want to draw from as a model. Raleigh and Durham, North Carolina have monthly reports online. And then I believe it's Durham that makes an annual report to their legislative body. So there's a lot of framework that we can draw from for how we present this information to you guys and to the public. The kind of takeaways from some of the data peer review is, again, it's incremental change. It's not even adopting these policies citywide does not necessarily make them more cost-effective, affordable, doesn't deal with all of the other factors that come into these issues that have kind of led to this housing situation. So it is incremental change. Also, extenuating circumstances can delay a rollout. So that Minneapolis's data that started in January 2020, obviously it was affected by the pandemic, by construction material costs, by all sorts of extenuating circumstances. And then finally, a lot of the things that we found were just that a clear and efficient review and approval process is critical. So that goes back to the process slides that Amy was breaking down, how having staff that are invested and empowered and having documentation available. Samuel, in doing some research, found that in Spokane, Washington, they have a specific mental housing support team that you can schedule little calls with to talk to planners or plans reviewers about how to work with your property. So we have a lot of inspiration for how we can support folks working on these. We did a peer review of sort of comparable cities in the Southeast, the ones that have adopted or are working through these types of zoning code changes. And I can share it with you guys. They all have really good websites, but both Raleigh and Durham in 2019 and then 21 and 22 allow duplexes in all single family zoning districts at this point. Durham has more tiered, both of them have tiered allowances based on the zoning districts or proximity to transit. And they have really good documentation on monitoring and reporting. Arlington, Virginia's is kind of in progress right now, but the proposal and what was adopted by their council was to allow up to 6 units in zoning districts. Obviously, Arlington has a different, being close to DC has a really different situation than Knoxville or even Raleigh or Durham. But they have these design and dimensional standards to ensure compatible scale. And then we talk about Memphis a lot and the building code amendments that have been sort of underway to permit these structures under the residential code. Memphis does a really good job of prioritizing what they've been doing lately, or they have wrapped up as a major comprehensive plan, and they really prioritize middle housing in that comprehensive plan. So also there are a lot of municipalities that we see cited, especially when we were working with Opticos, we hear stuff about Greenville, Chattanooga, Asheville. So go ahead.
In the Raleigh example where you say that there are additional allowances, what does that mean?
Well, so there are you can do more intense forms of housing with additional units in areas that are close to transit. And I think they did this one alongside a rollout of a bigger transit program. So they sort of coincided it with this map, and they said, okay, when you're by this stop and this stop and this stop, you may be able to do up to a quadplex or a sixplex, something like that.
Okay, which that seems very applicable.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of cities have completed studies, is what we found. We kind of tried to look at our real immediate neighbors, Chattanooga, Asheville, et cetera. And a lot of them are more in the study process. And so, Knoxville is sort of moving closer to the Durham and Raleigh side of having policies, but we are starting in a smaller scale, having a specific target area as opposed to adopting this citywide. There is a lot in terms of the research of this kind. We'll share it with you guys, but it is a bottomless well. We could not have reviewed every municipality that has adopted this kind of code changes. And so there's a lot to take away in terms of best practices, but we hope that we can kind of keep engaging with comparable cities, especially as we look for recommendations on implementation and review. And we can always find a way to share those additional results with you guys. And kind of close out here and have any more discussion.
Any questions about that peer review?
Okay, not peer review.
Okay. I do want to bring up something before we close this out and open up to more Q&A. Is last night, City Council did pass a resolution requesting Planning Commission to consider an RN1 as part of this proposal. So I will share with you all that I don't know that we will be able to provide an in-depth analysis of what that looks like. We can tell you how many properties are zoned RN1 in the TDR, land use classification, how many are vacant, how many overall. But that is something that you've been asked to deliberate on.
Just in the TDR?
Just in the TDR.
The parking being probably the biggest barrier to housing. Did we look at Nashville's urban zoning overlay, because they removed parking minimums in those traditional neighborhood areas?
I did not specifically research that one.
And seemingly with success.
Yeah, that's a good one. I would like to, touch base on that.
What was the name of that zoning area? Urban?
It's the urban zoning overlay,
Oh, just urban.
Nashville's urban zoning overlay. And they drew a circle around or within the city, similar to ours, in those traditional neighborhoods, and remove the parking minimums.
Absolutely, yes, we will, I would definitely like to incorporate that into our peer review.
Anything else on the peer?
For the other cities like Minneapolis and Portland, I mean, they said the number of fourplexes that will. Did their numbers say as a percentage of parcels, or like the scales? How does scale compare to parcels? You know, we have X number of parcels. What percent?
No, those specific reports did not give a percentage of the overall built environment in the city. They were reviewing permits that were pulled that year.
Would it be possible to get back to that report and look at, you know, of these duplex, fourplex, a comparison analysis between, I mean, we can figure out duplex, fourplex versus single family percentage wise, but across, like large scale.
I guess my point is just if you threw out 204 fourplexes in Knoxville, that would be a much bigger percentage than fourplexes.
Yes.
Right? So,
Yeah.
just to help put the numbers in perspective.
Yeah, I think it's important to keep it in perspective. These cities are much larger. The situations are just different. The context is very different. What we can provide you all with is how many duplexes have been approved, but we have that data at least. And because as it comes to the special use process, so we can share that kind of data with you all. Kind of what's been happening in the last few years here since we updated the new code.
Sorry, just thinking on the request for planning commission to look at RM1 in TDR. Because I feel like the assessment of how much RM1 there was in TDR was quite small.
It is. There's 51 vacant lots. Do you have the data on? It's a very small percentage. It's under, I would say, under 4% of the total acreage zoned RM1 and TDR.
The vacant property?
No, of total RM1.
Yeah, like total, it was, when you compared it to RM2,
There's
it was very
many
small.
more properties zoned RM2.
0.62%.
No vacant.
It is vacant.
Vacant, yeah.
That is vacant. I apologize.
A lot of the RM1 in those areas is also LDR. Well, in some of the areas, is that correct?
That would not be what you've been asked to look at. So it's just RN1 and then traditional neighborhood zone, or the land use classifications.
But that might explain why there's not as much as you would see.
So the RM1 is 6.7% of the land area in the TDR, compared to RM2, which is 62.7%.
So I just bring it up because I think the proposal as it's written is trying to include the largest areas for consideration. And so the addition of RM1 in this case is interesting because it's a very small portion.
It is. So we'll be asking you all for guidance on whether or not you want that included in the proposal. And what I would anticipate is that we would need to go back, if you all wanted to say, yes, we want this included, we would come back with modifications to the development types that would be allowed.
Does that mean that if in December, Planning Commission said, yes, we do want you to include this in, we do want you to include RM1 in this proposal, that we would be delaying the actuality of the work?
That's a very good question. We would recommend that you not delay it. We recommend, that you go ahead
I'm
and
not
send it
asking
forward.
for delay, I'm asking would it delay?
That would be up to you all. whether or not you wanted to say, we want to postpone this for you to add RN1, or we want to go ahead and send this forward as it's currently proposed, and we want you to amend it to add RN1.
And that amendment could happen at the city council stage?
It could.
So then the RN1 would likely only be allowed to have up to a triplex, for example. Theoretically, or
Potentially. Yeah, you all could weigh in on that and direct us as well.
It seemed like a lot of the concerns from people who were at the meeting in support that had concerns were about the coverage and parking, and RN1 being one of those, wanting to include that, even if it is a small percentage. But then also the parking minimums seem to be a concern with a lot of the supporters who wanted to get a closer look. And part of the reason I was saying I had more questions about the parking is really in regards to the standards for accessible parking. If you do a triplex or quadplex, you'd have to have accessible parking, which would the minimum dimension of an accessible parking spot. If you just have one, you have to do a van, so the minimum dimension is 16 feet, which would take up a large majority of most of the parking. So, for example, if you have alley parking, because of that width, to fit within the majority, anything 50 feet or less, any of the lots that are 50 feet wide or less, once you take out 10 feet for the side setbacks, 16 feet for the accessible parking, you're left over with a little less than 3 parking spaces, I think. And so that, I think, is something that we need to take a closer look at hopefully before December and see if maybe there's alternatives to that. And then also, I don't know if there could be dimensional variations to the parking, like the Fort Sanders overlay allows for smaller drive aisles and more narrow parking spaces. Maybe that's a solution to that, but I mean, I think that it makes more sense to make the parking a little bit more flexible, because also the allowance of a variance for parking, I do wonder if you have to say that you have a hardship. If you're doing a quadplex and you can't get the standard parking, could BZA not say, well, you could do a triplex, this isn't preventing you from using your property, so no, you can't have a variance on this?
Yes, the BZA could say that.
Okay.
Yeah, because the definition for legal hardships is really clear from both statute, case law, and then also our city code. That has to be something inherent in the property itself, within kind of the dirt, if you think of it that way. It can't be, I've over-designed this project, so therefore I need a variance on the parking, or this isn't financially feasible, so therefore that's my hardship. It has to be something inherent about the property, whether that's topography, a sinkhole in a weird space that drives the design in a different direction, which requires an exception, whether it's kind of a wonky shaped lot, something along those lines. It has to be inherent in the property itself.
So let's take that to the real applicability of this, because it seems like most of these lots won't have those unique challenges. So adding this variance, what would be a reason to approve a variance?
Well, the BZA is always tasked with first finding that hardship. So if they are coming forward and they don't have any of those exceptional circumstances, then no, there wouldn't be any cause to legally support the granting of that variance. However, we do have those administrative deviations that are included, and I don't know if you want to go back to that slide, Amy, but there are those included as well, where that can just go through staff approval. It doesn't have to go to the BZA Planning Commission or anything like that.
But the parking would have to.
If it's not included in the list of administrative variations, then it would have to go for a variance. But again, a variance is only allowed in the parking context for middle housing.
So are they bound by the same standards as BZA, the staff, on approving a variance?
On approving the administrative deviations? No.
Okay.
So
Lot width, corner side,
Right.
setbacks, design standards, I don't wanna.
Yeah, if you all want me to read it out, I can, or I can highlight it and send it to you. It's in section 4.6G, but I can share those with you. That's helpful.
But it doesn't cover parking.
It does not cover parking. No.
So-
Logan, I do agree with you that the accessible parking is something that we need to have a conversation on, for sure.
Yeah, because
I appreciate you bringing that up.
one thing, I was very gung-ho last month, and then with the delay, I was like, well, I'll take this time to take a closer look at some of the things that I've heard. So what I did was pull the tax records for all of the vacant parcels in a 37917 area or zip code, which covers North Knoxville within the perimeter. So it's not counting Mechanicsville and parts of East Knoxville that would be affected, but most of these dimensions are similar. So exported that, and then with the help of an intern, added in the dimensions of all of those parcels that we pulled, and also the zoning, just to kind of get a good picture of what would actually be applicable here. And from that data, in TDR, RN2, RN3, RN4, I found that I think about 52% of them are 50 feet or less. And then also for the quadplexes that might also include some of the 4 parcels that are 60 feet and would allow a quadplex. But point being, that would really, if these parking standards are required, 50% of these either could not be triplexes or duplexes, or they would have to have very large parking lots. And again, with the dimensional standards of a parking lot, like this, if you look out here, to have a double stacked parking aisle, drive aisle with parking spaces on each side perpendicular, that is 60 feet of width. So you can't do that straight on, like we talked about with that one example where you made the drive aisle too small. And if you have to come in and maneuver sideways, it takes up a lot of the lot space. So I do think that the parking, just by nature of how much space we need for vehicles, is going to be a lot more restrictive than we think, even with the lowered standards for that. So that's.
What's your solution for that?
No parking minimums.
Yeah.
Or at least, would you all
Mandates.
consider, I think there's one recommendation, within a quarter mile of the transit.
We actually intended to, we didn't really talk about that today, but that, it's coming back.
It's what?
It's coming back into our plan. What will be in front of you in December will include the 30% reduction within a quarter mile of transit.
Will you say that?
30%.
Say it one more time?
Will you say that from the top?
You're talking about 30% reduction.
That's what our code currently allows, is if you are, that's not something new, it's our code currently allows, if you are within a quarter mile of transit, you can have a 30% reduction in parking requirements. And we exempted that because in the proposal we put forward, we exempted that initially because we were taking parking from the original requirement of 2 per unit down to 1 per unit. We were already cutting it in half. Well, now we're putting it back in. So instead of exempting, not allowing that additional 30% reduction, we will be allowing that 30% reduction in the proposal that you will see before you.
What is your hesitation?
Of something.
What is your hesitation from
I was just asking if Commissioner Hill was considering or discussing something more than that 30%.
Yes.
Yeah. Do you want to speak on that? You want to clarify what you're?
Removing.
Yeah.
Parking minimums.
So I'd like to throw out two of the things we looked at. We looked at census data, and we looked at the most current data for the city of Knoxville. And you look at occupied housing, and break that down from owner occupied to renter occupied. It was around 15% of renter occupied housing in the city did not have a car. So 85% of renter occupied housing had at least one car or more. So the idea behind that, I think for owner occupied housing was around 5 or 6%, so it was much lower. So we did look at it kind of more granular or specific to the areas in the TDR. But the overarching thing is that while yes, we're trying to provide some flexibility for reducing parking requirements, there's still a level within the city. Parking, vehicle ownership is a part of rental parking. So,
And
let's stay-
owned units as well, and so it's still a significant, it is probably the number one thing we've heard the most complaints about,
Is what?
is the fact that we've reduced parking 50%. That is the number one thing we've heard, that we should take it back to 2 parking spaces per unit. And that's the number one thing that we have heard. If you add up all of the emails and phone calls and all of the things, that is the thing. And even just this week, going out into neighborhoods, they're concerned about the impact of parking. We're having a conversation, we're explaining, all of the great aspects of the details related to that, but it is still one of the biggest complaints that we are hearing.
Does an Optico say that your biggest barrier is?
Actually,
Parking
they
then?
encouraged us to consider 1 per unit.
And I would say just like even our varying kind of perspectives on this on the team that's been working on it is probably representative of the fact that everybody thinks something different about parking. And you guys as the commission have the capacity to look at the testing in front of you, at the standards, at stuff that other commissioners have done in terms of can you make this work, and you guys have the capacity to make decisions and recommendations on the parking aspect of this to city council.
Before it gets to city council. Commissioner Adams, did you have something else that you wanted to?
Yes, but I'm just trying to figure out how to say it.
Did anybody?
Brian, I know that double stack parking is allowed in some cases with single family. I've never been able to find in the zoning code when that is or isn't allowed. Would that be allowed in some of these instances where you could have a 40-foot deep, a little less than that, parking stall and park 2 vehicles back to back?
I think that'd be a conversation.
Okay, so we are. It's 10:20. I want to be really respectful of your time. We've almost been here for 2 hours. Do you guys have any other questions or comments? Share.
One more question. With another thing that I've noticed is this isn't widespread, but in these areas, there's often RM3 and RM4 that have different underlay, or not underlay, sector planes, like MDR and things like that. Some of those would not be allowed because of it still being an area-based density calculation. Some of those would not be able to get the same amount of density as would be permitted here. So have you all looked at how many existing RM3 and RM4 in these areas are not TDR by any chance?
I think if I follow your question, no, we have not. We have not looked outside of the TDR at this point.
Do you think that in these areas, I guess the 1 year plan would support, even if someone had, say, an RM4 with a different sector plan or an RM3, and they wanted to go TDR so that they could do missing that or the middle housing? Do you think the 1 year plan would support that change in a lot of these areas?
We would have to go back and take a closer look at the 1 year plan and look. It would be very site specific. I can't speak to that like wholesale. Like yes, that would work.
Okay.
Yeah, I want to clarify. So the housing scan that was produced did look at different areas, and so that's really the closest thing that we have to looking outside of the TDR. So there were other areas that were identified as potential areas that are walkable or have the potential to be walkable in the future. Questions, comments?
For parking, it could be fractional as well, right? We could say half a unit, half a spot per unit, and then, so you build a duplex, you could build 1 parking spot, right?
You all can recommend whatever you think is best.
Is another option to, like, parking seems like the big sticky wicket. So how feasible is it for, at least a year's time for the parking to be part of the development assessment, so that it's not something that's mandated by it will be X, but if you're doing a duplex or anything in the MMH that you're working with planning to come up with a parking plan that's specific to that development, so that there's I know you're probably going, you have a job, like we're kind of busy, but I'm just trying to think about how do we get something passed so that we've got some options for the city, because I feel like there is with good measure, bringing us concerns and accessibility. Like there are a lot of specific things that need to be addressed, but how do we keep moving it forward?
I think it's a good suggestion, and I understand where you're going there. But from our perspective in planning, we want the rules to be as transparent and easy to administer as possible. Transparent for our staff, not just planning staff, but plans review and inspection staff, and transparent for the community, so they know what they should expect. Should they expect parking, or should they not expect parking? And also for anybody who's developing or redeveloping their property, I think it's really important for the rules to be clear. So I understand where you're going, but maybe we need to test this out. But I think putting that onto staff and making that determined on a case by case basis, I think is outside of our purview, and I would recommend against that.
I would say too, from a legally challengeable aspect, when we have more subjectivity in the code, generally not a great thing, because that invites litigation as well.
I do want to say that regardless, parking is the topic at the moment, but we've had a lot of other topics come up today, and I just want to say that broadly, when we sat down for our very first go at this with the core team that Amy mentioned at the beginning, none of us thought this was necessarily the final end-all be-all plan. We all took very seriously to heart Tony Perez with Opticos, his recommendation to create a foundational plan that can be built upon. And that was reiterated to us over and over, is really focus on the foundation, because there are likely to be changes. Our city is going to look different 3 years from now than it looks right now. And that's not to say that we have to wait 3 years to make any changes, but that's also to say that this has to be a living, breathing, ever-evolving process, and our code has to function somewhat that way. And so I just kind of wanted to say that more broadly.
Yeah, I think that's a good segue in terms of, thinking about zoning and land use. It really does require that balance between broad community input and community goals and site-specific impacts, which I think we've gotten into a lot of discussion about today. And zoning and land use are just one of our tools. I didn't touch on this the previous slide, that we can leverage to address housing needs in our community and affordability challenges. We have to remember that zoning changes often almost always result in incremental changes over time. So the idea that this is going to be the solution, I think Cheryl makes a good point, is that our community continues to change, and we need to be responsive to that and make sure that we're being responsive also to community goals and what the vision is for the future. So just keep that in mind, that passing this is not going to be a wholesale change the city's going to see, but there's probably not any zoning change that we could pass that would be a wholesale change. I mean, you think about our corridors. When we updated the city zoning code, we really opened that up to by right development. You can do multifamily all up and down our corridors. We have not yet to see that. I think we will in the future, but it's, again, slow, incremental change over time. Again, if there's any other burning questions, we can take another one. We really appreciate y'all's time today. We think this is a really important discussion. And if you all have follow-up questions, please feel free to reach out. Lindsay's already mentioned a few things that she's going to send out to you all, so we'll be following up with some additional information.